I am Kathy Clark, and I am the faculty director for CASE, the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. And I am delighted to welcome you to our CASE Executive Speaker Series. And we're featuring Audrey Choi today, who we're thrilled to have. As many of you may know already, Audrey's a bit of a superstar. She is Morgan Stanley's Chief Sustainability Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, and serves on the firm's management committee. She founded the Morgan Stanley Global Sustainable Finance Group in 2009, which seems like a very long time ago now. So she's got a lot of experience in impact and ESG and sustainable investing. And she also created the Institute for Sustainable Investing in 2013. Prior to her time at Morgan Stanley, she's held senior policy positions in the Clinton administration, including chief of staff at the Council of Economic Advisors and domestic policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore. And before that, she was a journalist, a foreign correspondent, and bureau chief. I don't know where you were bureau chief. That was interesting.
In Bonn.
Wall Street Journal. Where was it?
In Bonn, Germany, when Bonn was still the capital.
Oh, cool. So we've invited Audrey today to have a conversation about her own personal journey, as well as some of the work she's done at Morgan Stanley and where she thinks, sustainability might be going. And so I am just personally so delighted to have you here, Audrey, because, we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the years, and you're just one of the most refreshing and honest people around about what is going on, and very visionary. And so just excited to share a little snippet of that with our audience today. So maybe to get started, could you talk a little bit? I just gave your bio, and that's like the official version. Could you talk a little bit more about your own journey? I don't know if you ever expected that you would end up as a senior executive at Morgan, for example.
It was all part of the grand plan.
Yeah, there you go.
I sure would be happy to. But first of all, we just start to say, Kathy, again, super excited to be here with you, and thank you for the invite. And all the nice things you said about me, I would say, sort of right back at you, Kathy, because I do remember back to what does feel like ancient history now of 2008, 2009, when we were all just starting this. And, you were one of the few people who had already been thinking about this for a long time. And so, anyone who has the opportunity to learn from you and work with you at Duke is extraordinarily lucky in my book. You've been one of the real, genuine thought leaders on this. And, so much of what we've done has really been inspired by a lot of things that you've done and partnered with us on over the years. And so, again, I just really want to thank you for that. It does seem that these days, everywhere you turn, there's 100 new people and/or institutions who are proclaiming their recently discovered, supposedly long-standing commitments to sustainability, impacting investing in ESG. But Kathy, you were really one of the huge trailblazers. So I know we've been wanting to do this for forever. So excited that back in the before, things like, I don't know that I could get down to Duke for that time period was always in our way. So the silver lining upside of Zoom is that we can finally make this work.
Yes, so grateful, and thank you for your overly kind words.
Now
back to you.
All right. Yes, classic Kathy. No, not about me. So to your question, Kathy, yes, I absolutely had no expectation that this would be where I ended up. And so, if we did one of those sci-fi style, talking to past Audreys, she'd be like, what? How did this happen? So to give you guys a quick sense, sort of starting from, I was in college, I was a comparative literature major. Focusing on French and German, and I was on the spectrum of applied comparative literature to boho lit crit theoretical. I was out here, so I was basically on the verge of philosophy of language and philosophy and semiotics and all this very esoteric stuff. And I thought that it would have been my dream to end up being like Kathy, a tenured professor at a major university, and that was sort of the goal. But I knew that after college I wanted to study abroad. And I got a Fulbright scholarship and to Germany, where again I had been studying German, and I went there with a very sort of lit, very comp lit style assignment. My Fulbright project was to do a comparative study of East and West German feminist literature. But I ended up in Germany in what turned out to be the last year that West Germany and East Germany were separate countries. And within the first week, my best friend that I met at the foreigners office, because literally the university had a foreigners office, was an East German defector. And I found myself immediately embroiled in sort of German politics. I spent my breaks kind of going off to East Germany, smuggling Western magazines to her family, helping her family arrange a meetup in Hungary, and became kind of completely caught up in everything that was going on in Eastern Europe. And that was when I actually finally realized that economics, which during college I was like, I'm not taking the introductory economics course. The whole football team takes the introductory economics course. It's a 1,000-person course. Why would I take that course? And like, who cares about supply demand curves? When you're actually in East Germany and realizing that, you know, this child that I saw on the streetcar was eating this like tiny little shriveled apple and smiling, and, you know, and literally 20 kilometers away, there were kiwi and passion fruit and bananas in the dead of winter in West Germany. You're like, oh, this is this tiny sign of why economics and economic politics and philosophy actually can be a social justice issue. So that's what launched me to saying, I'm going to put lit crit aside for my 7th career. So maybe after I retire from finance, one of these days I'll become a boho lit crit professor. But that I had to somehow be part of the German story and part of these sort of upheavals that were affecting my friends, and really part of telling these stories of people whose lives and whose opportunities were just so fundamentally changed by the accent of which side of the border they were born on. So that's what led me to journalism. I ended up, crazily enough, being super lucky because I happened to be fluent in Germany, because I happened to be fluent in sort of the German experience and story. At the age of 22, I was sent back to Germany as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal to open a new bureau and expand our German coverage. Ended up having 4 amazing years, 5 years there as a foreign correspondent bureau chief, covering European steel, automotive, chemicals, German politics, and started the column on entrepreneurship and private equity. And then fast forward, I ended up actually after about 6-7 years altogether in Germany in journalism, coming back and realizing that I kept on trying to get at the issue of policy and how policy was affecting people's lives through my stories. Like, so I'd be a chemical reporter talking about policy, or a steel reporter talking about policy. And I found I was like, okay, I just need to actually do this. And then I applied for and was lucky enough to win something that I would definitely encourage you all to apply for, which is called the White House Fellowship. It was established by President Johnson and has become sort of the nation's premier leadership fellowship, and brings people in from all different walks of life to work directly with a cabinet member in government. And you can see sort of, you know, bird's eye view of public policy making at the highest levels. I found it completely inspiring and amazing. And I ended up spending a total of about 5-6 years in the Clinton administration. And I had this great experience of being in a regulatory seat at the Federal Communications Commission, in the executive branch of the Commerce Division. And then I got asked by Vice President Gore to work for him as his policy advisor, and then by Janet Yellen to be her chief of staff. So amazing whirlwind. And then my government service came to an end at approximately 12:01 p.m. on January 20th of 2001. So, you know, if you serve at the pleasure of the president, you depart at the pleasure of the next president. And that was after the election of 2000, which, for those of you old enough to remember, the election of 2000, at the time, we thought that was a wild election with, you know, with the radical things of like recounting votes and hanging chads.
Hanging chads, yes. Exactly.
Yep. So, you know, the whole what the Chad kind of era, we thought that was crazy in our democracy. And I then ended up actually, Al Gore called me up out of the blue on a Saturday morning and asked me to work with him on his books and his post-White House life. And then I eventually went back to business school. I was very old to be at business school relative to my peers. And then after business school, I ended up working briefly for a little while for a private equity company, and then for a nonprofit. And then 15 years ago, I happened to, by accident, meet someone at a leadership council dinner for one of my favorite nonprofits in the world. And the poor guy next to me, whose wife didn't show, and therefore we got seated next to each other at sort of two empty seats, said, "Who are you? What do you do?" And I told him, and stunningly, he said, "Oh, you should come have lunch with me at Morgan Stanley next week because, maybe there's a spot for you here." And I had no idea what I could possibly do in investment bank, but since I will talk to a fence post, we had a great lunch. And so 15 years ago, I started at Morgan Stanley, and as they say, kind of the rest is history. I mean, the last thing I'll just stop with, and Kathy, I promise my future answer will be much shorter, but since you asked for wife, I will just say as the teaser to our future conversations, they did not hire me to do sustainability. They did not hire me to do anything remotely related to impact investing. I was initially hired to work on women's leadership development, having never done anything in HR or on women's specific issues other than being one. They soon morphed me into leadership development for both women and men, because I said you can't kind of fix women's leadership if you're not engaging with the men. And then I ended up proposing what ultimately became Global Sustainable Finance in the Institute. So it's been a long and winding journey.
Yeah. So there's a lot that there's a lot of subtext to that story that I'm sure people can notice about the winding, about not knowing where you're actually going to go, or people recognizing your talent and pulling you in. And also about the significance of dinners and who you sit next to, right? Which we don't do anymore, but we're starting to do again, which is really, really important for careers. Tell us a little bit about your role, how it's evolved at Morgan Stanley, and kind of what you think some of the key, important pivot points have been.
Yeah. So look, the first was, Kathy, you said it. So literally in 2008, as the world was sort of careening into the depths of the financial crisis, is when I'd spent about a year at Morgan Stanley. I'd sort of seen what this place could do. And I was, my enduring, the one sort of, red thread throughout all of my different pursuits has always been trying to figure out how we create impact, right? And my big sort of, if I have one sort of theory of change to be, carved into my tombstone, it's really about seek impact in your work, but also find impact in your work. And that no matter where you are, there is a way to use that, so whatever lever of power you've got, a finger on, you can use that for impact. And so I had seen that Morgan Stanley, we just touched everything as a financial services firm. And so 2008, I was literally taking a little PowerPoint deck around the executive floor being like, we should start the thing called Global Sustainable Finance, which at the time wasn't even called that. And I basically was advancing this theory that it was great that we did philanthropy, and that's a critical thing that we continue to do. But where we really have impact was through the capital markets. And if we could find a way to blend the capital markets with impact, that's where we could create so much more change. And so phase one was literally a PowerPoint deck with this cockamamie idea that Morgan Stanley should endorse founding this business group, not a philanthropic group, not a marketing group, not a CSR group, but a business group focused on sustainability. And then Kathy, I think that's, when you and I met, and most of my time there, I spent a lot of time sort of proselytizing inside the building and then with our clients that yes, this was a thing that Wall Street should do. Yes, this did make sense. And this, and I got a lot of so this is kind of what I called the cute phase or the charming phase. People are like, oh, that's lovely, dear. Just don't spend too much money, don't take up too much resources, don't take too much time, but that's lovely. And maybe my clients' wives would like to talk to you next time they're in. I mean, I literally had very lovely colleagues who said that. By the way, women actually control more money than men, and then with the inheritance coming in the future, even more so, but whatever. So yeah, I talked to the wives and to the husbands. And then, fast forward a number of years after that, we would get into what I would call sort of the charismatic phase, right? It's when you started having things like, Etsy being one of the first B Corps to IPO. You had people sort of, you had the Bellagio gathering about impact investing. It suddenly was very sort of, no one really knew what it was. No one was sure there was business, but it's very charismatic. So they'd be like, oh, Audrey, why don't you come along as the sort of charismatic, interesting part of this pitch? And then phase three was commercial, where they're like, oh, yikes, or some other word. there's a lot of money here. This is really commercial. Like, you need to come to the board presentation. You need to go to our client and talk to their board dinner. You need to do all these things. And so I sort of, I think those early years were from, like, as I said, sort of from like charming to, charismatic to commercial. And now we're in sort of like commercial cubed on steroids, where literally we are seeing that every single division, every single business desk, every single person, every single client is talking about ESG. There's still skepticism. There's is it greenwashing? There's everything is ESG. There's you're only doing ESG because it's money making. There's everything. But right now, like, we can't avoid, everything is ESG.
Yeah, well, that must feel really satisfying to you in some ways, because you're definitely, out of the cute and charismatic, and now you're kind of like, everyone wants to know what you actually know, right? And become, and how do you take a firm that perhaps was skeptical in the past, and now wants to learn really fast? And I wonder if some of your signature initiatives are kind of arranged around that goal.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I think that, and again, what I would say is, I think that what's been amazing at Morgan Stanley is that they were willing to do that. And again, whatever skepticism I got, most of our competitors weren't even thinking about it at all. So they weren't even thinking about it to be skeptical about it, right? And skepticism and inquiry.
It's kind of conversations. I don't interrupt you, but it's you started the conversations early, right? So that's the advantage that you can have, right? It's hard. We have a lot of students who kind of say, should I be the first proselytizer inside an organization?
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that. It takes a lot of courage to be patted on the head a lot, or to be argued with, or to keep going. But at least you were having those conversations. And so how does that relate to, I mean, are there particular, I don't know if there's any kind of ahas or you have about how have you gotten people over the hump?
So I would say, I would say a couple of things. I mean, so one is, look, I think that, it has to be said that none of this would have happened if, when I went with my little PowerPoint deck up to the 40th floor, if James Gorman, and John Mack, who are our president and CEO at the time, if they had said no, the whole story would have been either non-existent or very different. The fact that, again, that like James Gorman back in 2009, when sustainable investing was literally not a term of art, was like, yeah, go for it. Let's see what that is. Let's develop it, right? It didn't mean that, I still had to do the work of convincing people, in a 60,000 person firm, that's a lot of shoe leather, right? To kind of gumshoe around the organization and get that done. But, so it wouldn't have happened without that endorsement from the top. And the willingness to give me sort of the platform and the leash to do it. And Kathy, I think you're also totally right, though. It does take a certain, a certain
stamina,
personality, stamina, or, personality disorder to be, to want to keep proselytizing. And as soon as someone's convinced of something, to say, okay, that's yours. You go print, you go turn the crank of that 1 million times, and I'm going to proselytize the next thing that you don't yet quite, that isn't quite yet proven out. And so for me, I found that, in my sort of personality and career makeup, I really kind of love being someone who looks across different sectors, sees intersection points that may not yet quite be obvious, and then is willing to kind of like test and scout and experiment. And then as things become, more mainstream, so, to have that be other colleagues who can really drive that to scale. I think that one of the biggest things, and Kathy, this, is really your sweet spot as well, is in the early years, the biggest issue we had was that people loved the concept of impact investing. Like, gee, wouldn't that be great if we could save the world and make money? And that's a great concept, but they didn't believe it was true. And so that's really why, after, initially in 2009, we kind of put our flag in the ground by founding Global Sustainable Finance as a business group. But in 2013, we're like, we really have to kind of up the ante on the research, the thought leadership, the facts, and really start to build that picket fence of, one picket at a time of evidence, so that people can really start believing it. And, that's where we've, I know we started to collaborate so much and seeing each other so much, because people just didn't believe it. They always believed that there was necessary discounts to returns, that it was sort of somehow kind-hearted and soft-headed. And, after now, with all the research showing that, sustainable investing has been, either holding its own or in many cases outperforming, and then also with lower downside volatility. And so probably the most, one of the sentences I've said probably the most times when talking to people who are on the journey of being convinced is, if I told you that there was some factor that you could add into your analysis and it would give you the same or better returns with lower downside volatility, how many people are completely uninterested in finding out more about that? Right? Like no trader or investor. And they're like, okay, so the secret is that's actually ESG and sustainability. It starts turning the conversation very differently.
How many studies saying that did you need to actually produce before people started believing it? Because I still think there's this perception gap, right? People like, you can't possibly, that can't be true.
Yeah, no, look, so first of all, I would say one of the biggest things was that, thank goodness it wasn't just us and our studies, right? And so it really has been, this collaborative and eating studies like the ones that you've been doing and at Oxford and that, George Serafeim at Harvard and this whole sort of chorus of top organizations and institutions doing this work. But it also did really help with, as we've built up, our quant team to really crunch numbers, right? So it's not like, oh, this is, some little backwards tested sort of artisanal study, right? I think one of our sort of, biggest kind of flags in the ground was when we did the analysis of 11,000 mutual funds over 15 years of performance, comparing sustainable strategies to traditional strategies, and that's where we started seeing the outperformance in return and a significant difference in downside volatility. So it really took this sort of whole course. But you're right, Kathy. I mean, it still is this, I think it's like really, sort of back in like our amygdala, like our lizard brain, that if it's sort of good for the world, it probably is not as profitable. And, from our first study that we did of our first survey we did of investors maybe, 8 or 10 years ago to now, we still see that even as the percentage of investors who are interested in sustainable investing just goes up and up and up. So it's 99% of millennials who are interested in sustainable investing. I don't know who that 1% is. They're certainly not in your classes, but we'll find them. But 99% of millennial investors are interested in sustainable investing. And it's like 85% of everybody else, right? It took a while to kind of drag everyone up, but everyone now is in the 80 to 90% interested in it. But really fascinatingly, in this last study especially, we found that the millennials and Gen Z investors were the most interested in it, the most likely to do it. And despite all the evidence, the most likely to think that they were going to have to take a discount to returns. And yet they still wanted to do it.
So they were willing to take a discount because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, because they felt like, climate change, plastic waste reduction, gender issues, and community development, those were kind of their main themes. They felt it was just so important to align their capital to it that even if they had to take it, or in some cases, especially if they had to take a discount, they felt like that was work that needed to be done and that it couldn't be left to just business, to just government and charitable spendings.
So when you, 2008, 2009, when we were collectively trying to build this field, there was a set of evidence, and I was mostly doing evidence on the private market, right? There was a set of evidence coming out of the private market, and Cambridge and the GIN did some research around that time and kind of said, this is as good or better. There was a lot of kind of over, meta studies on the ESG level. How did you guys put the public and private together in a way that made sense to the advisors at Morgan Stanley? Can I ask that? Does that make sense?
Sure. So I will say, I think we probably, we focused more on the public markets just because that is more, that was where we were more accessible, for the vast array of our clients. Right. And I think and I don't know, it wasn't necessarily a scientific or super academically sound decision, Kathy, I would say. But I think I'm a big believer in, right, no matter what area of life it is, like, what's your comparative advantage? Right. Our comparative advantage was not necessarily going to be getting individual high net worth individuals or institutions into individual private equity deals or private deals. I mean, we do a bunch of that, but then we packaged up as private equity funds, et cetera, et cetera. Our basis advantages that we had at the time, 16,000 financial advisors, 4 million client households. We had this sort of vast reach. But you also couldn't put something on the platform to that group if it didn't have a certain scale and accessibility. And so it was going to be public tools. And so for us, that's really where we focused. And where we really focused within that is how to actually make it more accessible. So, Kathy, you probably remember, when we first started it, if you go back, one of the big issues, especially back in like, I don't know, 2010, 2011, is people, even investors who were interested in sustainable investing, who liked the idea of it, would say to me like, yeah, Audrey, I'd love to, but I tried that once. I tried back in 2007, I invested in a clean energy tech private equity fund, and I got killed compared to the rest of my portfolio, which did well. And I'm like, okay, but that is completely the exact opposite of what I learned in 6th grade from the scientific method of experimentation, right? Where you have a robust, globally diversified portfolio of objects, and you're going to compare it to one anomalous, like, dart against the wall of whatever you happen to choose as your sustainable investment portfolio. It's like, how can we build a portfolio so you can actually have a control and a reasonable alternative? And the first time we built that, we were so excited that we were, after working so hard with a lot of these funds, we were able to bash the minimum investments down to only $600,000 for a balanced equity portfolio with sustainability and only $400,000 for an all equity portfolio. And that made way more accessible to people who weren't, Richard Branson and other billionaires. That similar thing now where you can, with one click, choose a diversified portfolio that follows the recommendations for diversification of our Global Investment Committee. You can now do that for as little as $10,000 or even $5,000.
Wow.
So that's kind of where we focused our and so that's right. So then when you have the Gen Zs coming out with their first investable dollars as they come into the job market, they could say, okay, I'm going to open my account and my self-directed account. I'm going to choose the climate change fund, $5,000, and we're in.
When you look across, and you may not be, I'm just reacting to what you're saying a little bit. When you look across the different asset classes, and obviously they've changed a lot since you started this platform, which are the ones that are most robust for sustainability options, and which are the ones that you think are still in development?
So I think in the early phases, I would say the bulk of the assets and the bulk of the fund options were really in sort of the exclusionary bucket, right? So that was institutions or individuals who say, I can't sleep at night if I have XYZ in my portfolio, whatever that XYZ was for them, whether it's Sharia funds or anti-tobacco or guns or whatever it was, that was sort of the biggest bucket. And then the next one was sort of ESG integration, but people weren't yet completely sure what that meant, and the data wasn't as robust. But there was a sense that, if we get well-managed companies that think that E and S and G as part of their management, that'll be good. And I would say what we've seen now is a shift. I would say that ESG integration bucket is the one that has gained the most both dollars and sort of gravitational force field of, and again, now you've got, better standards like the SASB standards across all the different industry segments and better understanding of the value that ESG can provide. I would say now kind of the biggest area with the most choices is somehow ESG integrated mainstream funds. And then I think it's always going to be, smaller, but sort of the pointier, sharper ends of the tips of the spear will be in sort of thematic specific funds on the public side, and then obviously private equity impact directive kind of funds. But from an interest, so that's from a flows perspective. From a passion and interest perspective, we're definitely seeing that both the younger investors and the most sophisticated investors, they're like, ESG is like, ESG generally is like, so 2019 or before, right? Like now I want specifically, not even just climate, I want climate mitigation, or I want a climate adaptation fund, or I want a biodiversity fund, or I want a gender diversity fund, or I want a social justice fund, or I want, it's much, people really want to understand what their investments are driving.
That's really interesting. It's a great opportunity, right? Because you can
absolutely
create the demand. You're the supply, creating, kind of trying to get the demand to match you. Can we talk a little bit about, we've talked about ESG and impact, but you've named everything you've done sustainability, and sustainability has really changed and gotten very, very specific, right, in the last few years around net zero, or I know you guys have done some things around plastics. Can you talk about kind of where you guys have decided to kind of go deeper into sustainability and where you think it's significant right now?
Yeah, so I'd say, I guess there's two things. There's sort of the kind of innovation edge, and then the kind of the origins and what I think is sort of our kind of flywheel. You're right. We did when we were first coming up with a global sustainable finance name. So way back in 2008, the very first little deck I had, the group was actually initially had the worst name ever. It was ESFOCR for Environmental Social Finance Group and Office of Community Reinvestment. Because for all sorts of various reasons, people are like, well, you need social finance, but you need community reinvestment. And it was like, so when we, about 11 months in, we're like, that's a terrible name. We're going to like rebrand. What should it be? We worked with all these different names, whether it was impact, whether it was ESG, this something. Although ESG was at that point was not really, it was used in Europe, but it wasn't really, here people were talking about, about socially responsible investing. We're like, we're definitely not talking about social responsible investing. We ended up on sustainable because I really felt that, especially as a Morgan Stanley group, that I wanted to make sure people understood that what we were talking about was true sustainability in kind of the broader meaning of the word as well, which is if we put something in front of you as a Morgan Stanley client or as the Morgan Stanley board or a Morgan Stanley shareholder, if we put something in front of you that was impact, high impact, but wasn't financially sustainable, wasn't economically sustainable, as well as environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable, we were never going to get funding for a second year. And so for me, I've always said by sustainability, I mean sustainability with a capital S. So not the sort of narrow green only sustainability, but really that this is a form of economic activity that can fuel itself to grow. And in so growing, if it's got a sustainable model for society and for the environment, you will end up getting this great sort of multiplier effect. So that's why I like so hewn to sustainability in its fullest sense, not in a sort of a narrow eco sense. I think now what we're really focused on, again, as from your earlier question, it has been really wonderful to see sort of everyone rushing into ESG. There's things about that keep me awake at night, which we can talk about later. But I feel like it's really important to focus on sustainability from a innovation and solutions perspective, right? So the couple of things that I'm really excited about from some of our new initiatives that we're driving out of the Global Sustainable Finance team. One is our plastic waste resolution that you mentioned. So 3 years ago, we said it's great that everyone's embraced of ESG in general, but we also need some specific issue-focused ways to really drive impact and focus. And so we actually, as a financial institution, made a pledge that by 2030, that we would use our business as well as our footprint and our personal behavior to drive the prevention, reduction, or removal of 50 million tons of plastic waste from entering rivers, oceans, and landfills by 2030. So that has been everything from, making sure everyone's using reusable mugs to having a little, barcode that we scan every time we don't use a plastic bottle or whatnot, to financing options, and like working with Pepsi for $1 billion green bond, where a big chunk of the proceeds was going to reducing the virgin plastic across their bottling chain. And to creating plastic investment options. And then the latest thing that we've done that I'm really excited about, Kathy, is we've called the Sustainable Solutions Collaborative. We're sort of inspired by like the MacArthur Genius Awards to try to figure out who are those handful of geniuses from a sustainability perspective at a systems level. And we've been trying to really focus on identifying next wave, not next gen necessarily, although they could be, but next wave thinking about sustainability and how do you do things like, like one of our winners is a small Indonesian company, Cyclus, that is doing sort of a back to the future play to combat the issue of those billions and billions of little single serving sachets of soap and, right. And I mean, you remember, Kathy, like 20 years ago when that was like a great thing to be able to make affordable, accessible soap products.
Bottom of the pyramid. Great business practice. Yeah.
And that's been awesome. But now fast forward, there are literally billions of those little multi-layer plastic film, non-recyclable things clogging the oceans. This new company is basically doing, again, a back to the future sort of milkman style thing that you can, on your smartphone, say, I need an ounce of cooking oil, 2 ounces of cleaning fluid, whatnot on Wednesday, and the little moped comes up and dispenses it into your reusable containers. So it's a tech-enabled circular economy, plastic waste reduction. So those kinds of next era thinking is what I'm really focused on.
Well, that's really cool. It sounds like you're getting into, you're being able to, you've been adding layers along the years, right? The big summary of all this is, right, you've started small and you've been adding, and now you're adding social enterprise kind of innovation. Maybe it's bigger than, but that the innovative stuff at the end of the value chain,
exactly,
to get people excited and to help them out, which is fantastic. I'm going to open this for questions in just a minute. I wanted to ask you one last question while people are thinking about what they want to ask you, and that is kind of like future gazing. What is your prognosis on the future of sustainable investing? Do you think we're at a tipping point now? and what can we do to keep pushing, and what should we orient ourselves around in the next 5 to 10 years?
So that's a great question. So let me think. So so what's interesting is I would say 5 years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, sort of on the speaking circuit or whatever, people would often say, so what's the future of this niche of sustainable investing? And I would say, and people would look at me like I have 3 heads, right? I think that in the relatively near future, but I don't know whether it's 1, 3, 5, or 7 years, but I guarantee you it's a single-digit number of years, and probably a low single-digit number of years, that sustainable investing will become the norm. And there will certainly be people who choose to ignore ESG factors, but that will be some sort of contra fund strategy. And that at some point that it will be the norm, that regulators will be requiring it, right? And that climate change will be understood as the mother of all investment mega trends, right? And everyone's like, that's lovely. On to our next speaker, right? And so I think that's right, but that's clearly where we are today, right? You've got more than $30 trillion. Exactly. We knew, as someone from The Economist once told me, who worked on the, every year The Economist does these issues of like the year in the world in whatever future year, and they say there's 3 important elements to a good prediction: a number, a time frame, and a specific prediction, but you never put them all 3 in the same prediction.
I feel like that's the recipe for someone speaking, to make sure you have one of those missing so that you're not on the hook, right?
Exactly.
That's like your smart checklist.
So, but I kind of got, it's like, small single digit number of years that, that will be. So that's why I think we are today, that we're really on the verge of this being so mainstream that there are 2 things that I think about for the future. So like then again, look, the next thing that we're on the brink of, and you mentioned it earlier, Kathy, when we were talking, is again, it's only now a matter of time with this amount of dollars there that this becomes fully embedded in the regulatory regimes, from a consumer protection perspective, from a disclosure perspective, from a risk disclosure perspective, from a financial reporting perspective. So we're right on the verge of that, and so it will be then for really codified. I think then what we're going to have is those on the 2 different ends. One is, once you have the regulation of scrutiny and mainstreaming, right, we're going to have a lot of the sort of the shakeout that happens in any trend, right, where you go from early believers to disbelievers to skeptics to suddenly mass adoption and a little bit, and then you need a winnowing out period. So I think we're going to see a lot more of, is that really ESG? What do you really mean by that? And we are now henceforth going to tell you that this is what you must mean when you mean E or S or G, right? So
it's not going to be as vague. You can't be as vague going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For the good of us all, right? But then I think the other thing that I'm really excited about is I think that people are I think that we are also now going to be on the verge of a whole acceleration of innovation, where now that you do have sort of all of the, the asset managers and the equity derivatives traders and, we should all understanding ESG, there's now going to be the ability to say, right, and we've already started seeing it, like whether it's SPACs, whether it's sustainable IPOs, whether it's new collateralized loan obligations for specific use of proceeds to sustainability. I think we're going to see a lot more specificity. I think we're going to see a lot more innovation of traditional capital markets products. I hopefully that will drive a lot more sort of deep impact at scale. That's my optimistic hope.
Great. So I am going to look for questions in the chat, and looks like, and if people want to, if I call on you, if you want to unmute yourself and actually ask your question. Mike McCarg, can you start? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep. We can.
Hey, thanks, Audrey, for being here, and great to see all the case folks. My question was more about who you're looking to in the sort of climate justice movement to both inspire you and also hold the work accountable. So who do you sort of tap into?
Oh, golly. I think what's really exciting is that I think that we're seeing actually the two sides of the spectrum converge, right? And so, we are seeing a lot of the sort of traditional environmental groups. So I say I don't have one specific like person or one specific group that I would say, but what I think is really exciting is seeing the worlds converge, and a lot more of the climate people who used to be very focused on climate and parts per million and whatnot are focusing more on people, and a lot of the social justice organizations have really rallied more around understanding why climate is, frankly, the mother of all social justice issues, right? I will say actually, though, one of the people I've been really inspired by has been some of the academics who have done work around looking at previously redlined neighborhoods in the U.S. Right, and there was a study done, right, of, for those of you who are community development geeks, right, 1977 Community Reinvestment Act is passed by the U.S. Congress to prevent redlining of banks, not giving loans to redline just into low-income districts. Fast forward, what are we now, 45 years later, studies of those areas relative to the rich areas in the same climatic environmental, weather zone show that the low-income neighborhoods can be up to 20 degrees hotter in summer, 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in summer than the rich areas. Not because they're in a different climate zone, but because they have more concrete pavement, they have less parks, they have fewer playgrounds, they have fewer sidewalks, they have fewer trees. And that what you're basically seeing is the weather and, as a result, health impact of not having all this sort of lovely leafy green infrastructure. And so I don't know, for me that's been one of for me that was sort of one of the gateway facts that made my brain really kind of focus on, we have to look, not just at climate on a global scale, but also on how it intersects with income, with urban planning, and with social justice and nature as part of our infrastructure.
Great. So there's another question here that I'm going to paraphrase to get it a little tighter, which is from Elizabeth Brown. She's basically saying, the student, there's movements among students within their universities, for example, among campus stakeholders at Duke to push the investors of Duke assets to de-invest from fossil fuels. Her question is, do you have any suggestions on how to structure an argument? So the students are looking for ballast. Mm-hmm. Or resources. Is that
for how to lobby their endowments to mm-hmm. move away from fossil fuels?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what I would say there is, I think the thing that will end up being most effective to both gain an audience with the chief investment officer and or president of the university, who ultimately are the real people that you need to influence, is going to be having a conversation that I would describe with an adjective that I know is often seen as a bad word, which is incremental, right? Which is not to say slow, right? Which is not to say that we can be, not like incremental, like, yeah, we'll do it. But I think that when, when groups come to an institution saying, it's a dire situation and you need to pull the plug entirely, immediately. And anything short of that is going to lead to, protests and all the rest. A lot of times institutions, even if they want to go on that journey, they're like, but we can't teleport to that end destination, and we need sort of support along the journey. So I think what I would say is most important is for groups to really, if you're, as a student group, if you want to really advocate for this, is to really be very educated about, if we wanted to get to that fossil-free fuel place in 3 years or in 5 years or whatever it is, what are the steps that we need to make on the interim? And let's try to say we think it's critically important for you to goal set and to be on the journey, for the goal setting to not be like 2050, but something sooner than that. And these are some of the steps that we think are actually pragmatic, doable, feasible, not slow, and that we will actually work with you and support you to get you from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, rather than saying 0 to 5 or you're a failure.
Which is really interesting, because I think of, when I was, when I looked at this question, I think of the group that I see that is helping students do this is the Intentional Endowments Network. Mm-hmm. That has a lot of materials. I don't know if they have so much of an incremental approach, right? So I feel like there's an interesting dichotomy between kind of the activism organizations, and then, you can see from Audrey, everyone, she knows how to get people convinced, right? So you just heard it, right? Which is, you have to do it step by step, and to think about how you can break that down.
Well,
so
and
that each step doesn't seem so threatening.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I just want to, again, I want to make sure that people understand it's not accepting, a lesser product, right? And so, I mean, I had the enormous privilege of being on the investment committee of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund a number of years ago, and they actually sort of recruited me onto it, and their CFO at the time said, oh, I think actually it still is here, Jerry, said, at the board level, we were able to make this intention and put it into board policy that up to 10% of our endowment should be focused on sustainable investing, but we haven't been able to actually get there. And we haven't been able to get our external CIO to make the decisions, and we need help with this process. Long story short, I did end up joining the investment committee, and we worked on how could we actually move this institution there. And what's been pretty amazing is, that in relatively quick time, not only in quick time for philanthropy, but in quick time in the sort of just like I think within maybe less than a year, less than 18 months, we were actually able to adopt the investment policy and move to the state where the RBF was able to say that within 2 years they were going to be able to monitor their entire portfolio. They were going to move a certain sector to be entirely coal free, and then they would be working on the path to fossil. So they've ended up being one of these real leaders in saying, yes, you can do it, and you do it in stages, right? I mean, maybe you first start with coal, maybe you first start with but they now know everything that's in their portfolio. And they have a journey to really, and so it can be done actually pretty quickly, but helping people do it as a step-by-step journey.
That is really good advice. Really good advice on a lot of different change, but especially for portfolios that are already invested.
Yeah, right.
Right. You can't.
You don't want to yank things out at huge economic loss, and because the problem is, then everyone else points to it. Right. All you need is one story of the university blankety blank's endowment. Agreed to XYZ demands, pulled fossil fuel, fire sold XYZ, and now their portfolio is down, X% of returns. And then every skeptic will say, see, you lose money if you do that, as opposed to having a process that people say, oh, that was really smart. And now they're in a much better position. They're much better. They're more risk resilient to things like, say, oil prices spiking above $100 a barrel, and all the, there's certain upside to that for certain portfolios, obviously. But yeah.
So, Carrie Ganella, you asked 2 good questions. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask one or both of them?
I'll ask you. You left the breadcrumbs, Audrey, of saying we can talk about what keeps me up at night with ESG later. So now that it's later, I would love to hear.
Sure. I mean, look, and this is something that I've said for a while with sustainable investing, is that as practitioners of sustainable investing and investors in sustainable investing, we really have to try to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards on both fronts, right? On financial rigor, due diligence, credit worthiness, et cetera, so that it's a great investment, and on impact. Right, because with a sustainable investing, where the whole sort of promise is it's a both and promise, right? You're saving the world and you're making money. You have to really be very rigorous about both of them, and you can't let rigor on either of them slide to compensate the others. Because unlike a quote unquote traditional investment that is only looking at return, there's only one way that they get in trouble. I'm short of fraud, right? Is the returns aren't what they expected to be. But if you're promising both,
because we have rules for that.
Exactly, right? But with impact and returns, right, what keeps me up at night has always been, right, that as people suddenly say, oof, the ESG label sells, let's figure out sort of the minimum threshold over which we have to come, or maybe we're already there, to now label something ESG. If the industry as a whole doesn't hold itself to the highest standards of rigor on that, then we can set back the whole movement by either underperforming on financial returns or underperforming on impact returns.
Great. So I think what I'm going to do now is ask you some rapid fire questions.
Oh no, I'm always terrible at these.
No, okay. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. So what's great about asking these at the end of the talk is everyone's going to answer them in their own head before you speak and see if they match. So my first one is, what is your superpower, Audrey?
Oh, I think it's seeing connections between disparate things that aren't traditionally necessarily put together.
Mm-hmm. And what is your favorite word?
Favorite word? Collaboration.
Cool. If you had not become what you have become at Morgan Stanley, what profession would you have wanted to try?
Being a doctor.
Cool. What was your favorite pandemic activity?
Cooking. I confess that I indulged in the stereotype of a sourdough starter. So anyone who needs a 2020 sourdough starter, I've got lots extra. And that for probably close to 18 months, we ate every single meal at home cooked, no takeout.
So lots of cooking, lots and lots of cooking. Is that changing already?
Unfortunately, yeah.
I feel like we're all in this like transition now. We're like, oh, I can do things differently. Am I going to go back to all of my old habits, or am I going to try to keep?
Well, my son became a master bubble tea cook, so he can cook the pearls and do all the rest. But then he's like, now can we just order bubble tea from from the bubble tea place in the corner? I'm like, I started
baking bread and gained all this weight and then had to lose it. That was my activity. My activity was going up and down. I love the bread, but I can't eat it. What is your best? And this is kind of a longer one, so we can take a few more minutes on this, and we still have 8 or 9 more minutes, guys. So if you guys want to chat in any more questions, totally welcome to, because we have some more time. What's the best piece of advice you have for our students? Giving all, many of our students are, as you know, they're part of that 99% committed to sustainable everything, including finance. And they're trying to make their way. What do you think the big leverage points are in the next 5 or 10 years? And I'm going to link it back to one of Carrie's questions. She says, what's the thing that's charming now that they should not be too, invested in, but it would be, if that helps you answer it.
Well, look, so I mean, frankly, I would say charming is actually good because charming often precedes commercial. So, and often, if something you're doing is being labeled charming, it often means that actually that the mainstream just hasn't understood your brilliance. So you should pursue it.
Sometimes that means that, sometimes not.
I know. Well, no, if it's really not, if it's really owl-headed, people probably won't even call it charming. They might have other adjectives for it. So, right. But I would say that I actually think it goes back to your question, Kathy, about superpowers, right? So if you are interested in sustainable whatevering, sustainable investing, sustainable business, whatever it is, I would say do not constrain yourself to think that you have to get one of the jobs in something labeled sustainable investing, right? If your brain loves accounting, then go into accounting and you'll find a way to bring sustainability into it. If your brain loves, biochemistry, do biochemistry and figure out sustainable aspects to it. And I think the way that we truly make this through everything is if, every profession, every person, everyone throughout an org chart, right, from the newest hire through the CEO, is thinking about what is my superpower and how can I leverage that for a differential impact around sustainability issues that I care about.
Cool. Well, we do have a few more minutes.
Could I have a follow-up question? Sorry, sure. I had my hand raised. I don't want to dominate, and if someone else has a question, I just want to thank you so much for answering my question, Ms. Cho. Is it okay to repeat the name of the example you were talking about? Was it the Carnegie, the organization that you said?
RBF, Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
Rockefeller. Okay. Yeah.
And Rockefeller Brothers, there are many different Rockefeller entities, but this was Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Stephen Heinz is the president. Valerie Rockefeller is the amazing board chair.
Yeah, because I asked that question in part because my ears perked up when you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about how when you're initially proposing these ideas, people didn't think that the economic return could be as high as the traditional way to do this type of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of the question. And sorry for being so inarticulate. I'm actually an art historian, so I'm I just have awesome. An interest in making these changes. But so that's why I asked the question. So it does sound like it is possible to de-invest from something like fossil fuels and have sustainability and be as
Absolutely. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
you know, and RBF has been quite generous about sort of sharing their story and case studies and, you know, and talking about their portfolio and their journey. And look, the other example that I would cite is, you know, Al Gore founded Generation Asset Management more than 20 years ago, really on these, you know, principles quite early on. Because, you know, again, Al's been so early to climate change and so many other things really way, way, way around the curve. And they've had, you know, very, very impressive kind of top tier returns, and you know, with this 20-year track record of looking at ESG quite fundamentally, and again, not just climate, but things like, you know, is a company's compensation policy aligned to the CEO really has the long-term best interests of the firm at heart, not just his, you know, his next bonus, for example, or her.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's another question here from Emily, which I'm just going to paraphrase for time, Emily, if you don't mind, as she says she can't speak, which is if we're graduates who are interested specifically in sustainable investing and want to work for a team like yours, what kind of experience is necessary? Is it traditional corporate banking? What are the different kind of skill sets that you pull from?
So I would say, you know, I think we do have a couple of job specs that are live in the market now. So do go on to morganstanley.com careers, and there are some spots in our both in our team directly and in the firm that we're looking at, and sort of more broadly. But I would say that one of the things that we and look, one of the things I think, Kathy, your students today are so incredibly fortunate is, you know, unlike back when, like, you know, when we were trying to get into this, you know, first of all, this wasn't a thing. There wasn't a this to get into. Right now, there is this rapidly growing field of ESG investing, and you know, I just saw some blog by one of the big executive search firms talking about, like, you know, meet the executive search people who are doing all the hot ESG searches, and you know, it's like the thing that everyone is talking about. But I would say we don't look for any one particular thing, and we no longer say, well, before you can be a sustainable banker, you have to have been a banker. You know, what we've been hiring onto our team is, you know, some people with regulatory backgrounds, some people with massive quant backgrounds, and they know how to really just manipulate huge data sets. Now, applying that to climate, some of it is people who have been at, you know, EDF or WRI, from the environmental group. So I would say, again, it really just goes back to kind of know your superpower and how it can be, you know, put to use here. But yeah, we've hired everything from some former bankers to some former government people, former NGO people, former, you know, climate experts, data experts, quant experts, legal and regulatory folks. So I would say look for a firm or a team where you actually respect the culture and respect kind of the goals of the organization, and you know, you can find a way to make any of your you know, your quantitative or other analytical skills be relevant.
I'm going to take one more question from the chat and then we'll wrap.
Okay.
So, and I'm going to translate it a little bit, which is, you talked about being a comp lit major and then becoming a chief marketing officer. I'm imagining there's some connection between those skills. And the question is about the ESG label, which I'm sure we all have ambivalent feelings about. And the question is that a strong enough frame for what we're actually, the behavior that we're actually trying to get people to do? I'm going to repurpose your question, Michael, just so that I can have Audrey answer it in a broader frame, because I think it's a really, really interesting one.
Yeah, I would say, right. I mean, we can't always control the labels that the world decides to, like, go with, right? And so Kathy and you and I have had kind of, I think, like, you know, if Kathy and I ruled the world, probably neither SRI nor ESG would have been the dominant three letters of those particular eras. I think that one of the challenges, and you know, why I sort of share the ambivalence around, is ESG the right thing? And again, to your point, Kathy, earlier on, why I've so much gone for sort of sustainability as opposed to,
right,
because ESG on the one hand, at some point people will be like, well, ESG is everything, right? And at some point, yes, and right. And so, and I've tended to, you know, go back towards sustainability because it reminds you what you're trying to create. You're trying to create a sustainable growth engine that actually leads to sustainable sort of repercussions or, you know, follow-on effects. So look, the labeling wars is always a challenge. Yeah. And I think what I would encourage you to do is, obviously understand and be fluent with what ESG is and who cares about that and what that means, but always follow up for yourself and for whoever you're potentially going to be collaborating with or investing with or hiring or being hired by. What do you actually mean by ESG? What are your goals? How do you define it? And does that comport with what I'm actually trying to drive for?
Yeah, exactly. And he mentioned SDGs in his question. Obviously, there are other frameworks, and there's
Right.
many frameworks. But the idea being, can you talk about the goals, which I think is what you said, which is very much, I think, which is very smart. Well, I'm going to wrap it here. We're at 10:30. Please join me in thanking Audrey. Amazing conversation, and we're so grateful to you for being here, but also for all the incredible work that you've done over your career, and that has touched so many people. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Kathy, and thank you for all your work. And yeah, it was great to be with you all. And one of these days we'll do it in person if one ever does that again.
Yeah, exactly.
So, good to see you all.
We'll sign off. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.